Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here at our first annual Energy Summit. And thank you to everyone who is joining us in the room and also all of you who are watching this via live stream. My name is Goli Sheikholeslami, the CEO of POLITICO, as Sudeep just mentioned. And I'd like to thank TC Energy as well for being the presenting sponsor of our summit today. And I'm delighted to be sitting down for this conversation with TC Energy's president and CEO, François Poirier. So TC Energy is a North American energy infrastructure company with operations in the US, Mexico, and Canada. And as a North American energy leader, François is leading the company through a changing energy landscape, working to solve many of the world's complex energy challenges while balancing energy security and sustainability. Under his leadership, TC Energy has played a key role in expanding access to North American liquefied natural gas in response to the global energy crisis and is expanding its portfolio of energy solutions, including the development of carbon capture, hydrogen technology, and pumped storage. So that brings us to today's conversation, and he's joining me on stage to discuss how he views the private sector's role in the energy transition and what is needed from policymakers to make it a reality. So there's a lot to discuss, so without further ado, let's jump right in.
Sounds great.
So we have a room filled with energy policy and industry influencers, all focused on what's next and where to take the industry. So as someone with decades of experience and as someone who leads an organization with such critical impact on the industry, I'm just curious to hear from you, what excites you about the future of the energy industry and what you believe are the most pressing challenges facing it?
And Goli, thanks for having me. That's a great question to start with, and I'll keep it at 40,000 feet because I think we're going to drill down in some of the issues throughout the conversation. What I'd say is, in 30 years of being involved in the energy infrastructure business, this is the greatest opportunity in the history of our sector. Countries, economies around the world want to spend trillions of dollars in order to decarbonize and provide affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. That is a tremendous opportunity for anyone in the energy infrastructure business, as long as we are open to evolving our portfolios of investments and our capability sets, along with how the supply mix is going to evolve over time. So that's the opportunity. The challenge is, in many respects, how fast is that going to, can that happen? How long is it going to take? And what does doing it well look like? And what does doing it poorly look like? And that's the challenge that we have in front of us.
Yeah. So you were just talking about sort of sustainability, security, and affordability, and a phrase that sort of dominates these conversations is energy transition.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you could define that phrase. What does it mean to you, and how do you see TC Energy playing a role in this energy transition that we're going through?
Well, countries and economies have been going through energy transition perpetually for centuries, right? I mean, we migrated from burning wood to burning coal, and then we're still burning coal, but and then we went to burning oil and then natural gas and so on and so forth. So the energy systems are constantly in transition. But there are two ways to think about it, and this is something that I focused on a great deal as we're looking to motivate and help our own employee base understand the journey we're on and the vision we have for the organization. And there are two ways to think about it. One is energy deletion or removal as a way to incent investment in new forms of energy. And Germany was an example of that, whereby they shut down the majority of their nuclear plants. They mothballed most of their coal plants and invested heavily in wind and solar. And we've seen that removing forms of energy when the world's population is growing, when the 1.7 billion people on the planet who don't today have access to affordable, reliable energy and want to achieve it or acquire it, removing forms of energy is really exposing citizens and economies to price shocks and supply shocks. And that's what I would call an unorderly transition. An orderly transition, I think, is very important. And to me, it means energy addition, but with emissions reduction. So we need more of every form of energy, but we need to ensure that every single one of those forms produces that energy at the lowest possible carbon footprint.
And so I guess, is energy transition really a perpetual state?
In fact, it is. It is. And that's what requires constant investment. And I would argue that in North America, we have been underinvesting in our infrastructure for many, many decades. And that's part of the reason why the transmission grid in the United States requires so much capital to retrofit it to accommodate more wind, more solar, and more of a distributed generation model than has been the case for the last century.
And then just touching on the role of policymakers in this energy transition. So from a policymaking perspective, what is required to really make this a reality?
Well, you know, when you're focusing on affordability, reliability, and sustainability, I think the incentives that the Inflation Reduction Act are providing are meant to address the affordability question, and that's to allow and incent investment in new forms of energy supply and make them affordable as the technologies are being perfected, as they become more reliable. But there is another aspect to that. Given that so much investment is required, I like to say that uncertainty is the enemy of investment. And so it's not surprising, and I think it's quite correct for Congress to be focusing on permitting reform, because a good and robust permitting process provides the private sector with certainty of rules of investing. What are the criteria that I need to abide by in order to receive my permits? And secondly, that the timelines for receiving permits to make those investments are predictable. We've seen variability in the rules, we've seen variability in the timelines, and that's made it very difficult for companies like ours to decide where to make our investments. And if we are going to invest the trillions of dollars that are required to evolve the energy mix, we need more certainty, and that's where permitting reform comes in.
And would you say you're optimistic on that front?
I am. You know, to hear permitting reform, you know, on the lips of both Democrats and Republicans in this Congress, and a feeling that this is the Congress where something needs to happen is really encouraging. The debate, of course, is how it should happen, and that's the debate on both sides of the aisle. Some are more focused on ensuring that electrification is made easier through the incentives and through permitting reform and investing in the transmission grid. And others are more focused on having a more agnostic set of policies that don't necessarily pick winners and losers, but that focus on the end result, which is let's lower our emissions, irrespective of the form of energy supply.
And so, you know, the striking the right balance between sustainability, security, and cost, you know, what some call the energy trilemma, was put to the test last winter in Europe, and the U.S. played a major role in supplying European markets with LNG to replace Russian supplies. And what should our takeaway be from what we experienced, what the Europeans experienced last winter, and what do you think is ahead in this coming year?
Well, you know, I always like to say that luck isn't a strategy, and we were a little bit lucky last year in that going into the winter months, China was in another lockdown during COVID, so that did stem energy demand from China, and we also fortunately had a relatively mild winter in Europe. So while we did see significant price increases For example, an LNG cargo would be, as much as 10 times more expensive last winter than it was in the winters before. We did not see any shortage of energy to keep people safe, heat their homes, and cook their food. My concern this winter is that now that China has come out of its lockdown and demand is growing again, and if we have a colder winter in Europe than we did last year, will we have sufficient energy supply to meet their demands? One of the interesting developments last year was in 10 months, in 10 months, Germany went from concept to in-service on a regasification facility. And that took the Chancellor personally leading the effort. It was done in a political environment where there was a coalition government among Greens, Liberals, and another party, and yet they found a way in under a year to sanction and build and put in service a regasification facility, which is a timeline that I think policymakers in other countries ought to be reverse engineering to see what's possible. So necessity is always the mother of invention, and what we saw last year there is that it is possible to sanction and permit and build infrastructure in much shorter time periods than has been the case in the rest of North America anyways for the last several years.
So I also wanted to ask you about, so shifting to North America, so TC Energy it works across the Canada, U.S., and Mexico, and we've been seeing some rising tensions around regional energy policy.
Yes.
And interesting to think about sort of what lessons from what's happening in Europe should, from a North American perspective, sort of should we be taking away? But what is your perspective on the collaboration between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico as we deal with this energy trilemma?
Yes, and we are, I believe, the only gas transmission company that is present in all three of those jurisdictions. So we have a really good perspective. And what I would say again is that I think each country individually can navigate its way through energy transition. But again, it's very important for us to do it in an orderly fashion in order to make sure that it maintains the momentum that's being built. And that's where the collaboration between countries, I think, becomes really important, is how do we do this without creating price shocks or supply shocks? For example, in Canada, there's very strong policy support for nuclear, very deep expertise in nuclear. We actually own half of the largest operating nuclear plant in the world. And this is expertise that we could share with among Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans. We should be sharing knowledge around developing carbon capture technology and how can it be utilized to help make our oil and gas more carbon competitive. And I would like to see some harmonization in the policies between the countries so that we can have a freer flow of energy across the borders, which is what would help us ensure that we can make our energy supply affordable, reliable, and sustainable.
Mm-hmm. So, we have a lot of smart folks gathered here today. So to close us out, I thought I would ask you about what should policy makers be doing today to enhance global energy abundance and security while achieving sustainability goals?
So I think the way to think about this is if you can replace one form of energy with another one that is affordable, reliable, and sustainable, that has a lower emissions profile, that's what we need to be doing today. And so we have, India, Asia Pacific, and many other developing countries consuming coal and oil for their energy needs. And we should be making natural gas, which has a far lower emissions profile, more available. And so I think what's happening right now with the focus on policy reform is critical because North America has energy abundance, it has natural gas abundance, and not only can we stimulate the North American economy through the production and export of natural gas, but we can actually help with energy security and lowering the emissions profile of countries around the world.
Well, I think, thank you for that, for the conversation, François. It was a great way to kick off our session today. And thank you again to TC Energy for sponsoring our summit. So we're going to wrap it up here, and I am going to welcome our next panel to the stage, Manuel Quiñones, the editor of E&E Daily, who's going to lead the next panel for you. But thank you so much, and thank you so much, François.
Thank you.